The woman on the bench had been listening for 43 minutes. She sat perfectly still in her black robe, hands folded over a yellow legal pad she hadn't written on since the first witness took the stand. Below her, a mother was petitioning for supervised visitation with 2 children she'd left at a gas station 14 months ago. The mother's attorney spoke in careful circles, building a case out of treatment certificates and character references, and a rehearsed remorse that only surfaces when a judge is watching. The children's guardian ad litem kept checking her watch. The courtroom smelled like floor wax and stale coffee from the hallway machine, and the fluorescent lights hummed a frequency that settled somewhere behind the woman's left eye. A frequency she had stopped noticing years ago, because it espiqué was the background noise of her entire life. She touched the chain around her neck. A quarter hung from it, tarnished and worn thin at the edges, the kind of coin you'd walk past on a sidewalk without bending down. Her thumb traced the profile of George Washington, while the mother's attorney argued that his client had completed a residential treatment program, that circumstances had materially changed, that the children needed their mother. The woman on the bench studied the mother's face. The mother was crying. She had rehearsed the tears, or at least practiced their timing, because they arrived at predictable intervals during her attorney's pauses, swelling and receding like a tide that operated on a schedule. The woman on the bench had catalogued this performance before. 47 custody disputes that year, 12 termination hearings, 3 emergency removals where she'd signed the orders at 10 o'clock at night from her kitchen table while a pot of tea went cold beside her. Every case was different. Every parent's desperation was identical. She asked the mother one question. "When was the last time you called your children?" The attorney started to answer. The woman on the bench raised one finger and the attorney stopped. The mother blinked. The tears paused. The social worker said, "I should wait until." The woman on the bench had her answer. She ruled. Petition denied. Visitation would remain suspended pending a new psychological evaluation, and the children's current placement would continue under the supervision of the Department of Family and Children's Services. The mother screamed. The bailiffs moved. The courtroom emptied like a theater after a performance no one had asked to see. That woman was me. My name is Priya Desmond. I am 34 years old, a family court judge in Fulton County, Georgia, and the youngest person to hold this bench in the county's history. I handle the cases nobody wants. Custody disputes that drag on for years until the children in question are old enough to speak for themselves and say things that make grown attorneys look away. Parental rights terminations where both sides leave the courtroom destroyed and neither side leaves whole. Child welfare reviews where the best possible outcome is still someone's tragedy. I chose this work the way some people choose a religion, which is to say the work found me when I was 5 years old, standing next to a fountain in Lenox Square Mall, holding a quarter I'd pulled from the water, watching 2 people walk through a set of glass doors and never come back. But that part comes later. Harold Desmond died on a Tuesday. 4 days after I denied the visitation petition, 4 days after the mother screamed and the bailiffs moved, and I went home to an apartment that smelled like nothing because I hadn't cooked in it since the previous Saturday, my phone rang at 6:14 in the morning. The number belonged to DeKalb Medical Center. Harold had collapsed in his garden while pulling weeds from the tomato bed. Massive cardiac arrest. He was gone before the ambulance turned onto his street. I drove to his house in Decatur with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The route was 12 minutes. I had driven it hundreds of times, thousands of times, since I was a teenager with a learner's permit, and Harold in the passenger seat saying, "Signal first, then check." And the streets were the same streets, and the traffic lights changed on the same timers, and the world continued to operate as though the man who had built my entire existence had not just ceased to exist inside it. Harold's house was a 3-bedroom ranch with a paid-off mortgage, a garden he tended every morning before work for 30 years, and a kitchen where the Saturday egg pan hung on the 3rd hook from the left. The coat rack in the hallway still smelled like him. Sandalwood and something green like the inside of a greenhouse, a scent I had associated with safety since I was 6 years old and did not know any other word for it. I stood with my hand on his corduroy jacket, the one he'd worn for 20 years, the one with the fraying cuffs he refused to replace because it still works. Priya and I breathed in until my lungs couldn't hold any more of him, and then I breathed in again. The kitchen was exactly as he'd left it. The pan on its hook, the dish towel folded on the counter, the table with the nick in the corner where I'd dropped a casserole dish at 15, and he'd said the table has character now instead of getting angry. The window over the sink looked out onto the garden where the tomato cages were leaning sideways because Harold wasn't there to straighten them and the herbs along the fence were starting to go wild. Every Saturday for 29 years, Harold had made eggs in this kitchen. When I was small, he let me crack them, and I always got shell in the bowl, and he picked the pieces out with fingers that were too large for the task, but somehow managed it anyway. When I burned them, which happened every single time until I was 12, and figured out the difference between medium and medium-high, he ate them. He would take a bite chew with the deliberation of a man sampling something at a restaurant and say one word, "Perfect." I took the pan down, turned the burner to medium-high because some habits are harder to break than others. Cracked 2 eggs, burned them, stood at the counter and ate them, standing up, looking at the garden through the window, looking at the empty chair at the table, looking at nothing. "Perfect," I said to a kitchen that had no one in it to answer. Harold's desk was in the second bedroom he called his office, though it was really a room where file cabinets went to retire. He had been a civil engineer for DeKalb County for 32 years. He designed drainage systems. He reviewed construction permits. He drove a 2009 Honda Civic that he washed every other Sunday with a bucket and a sponge because he said car washes were a waste of money. He owned 3 ties, rotated them on a schedule only he followed, and wore the blue one on days that mattered. He never remarried after his first wife, Ellen, died of ovarian cancer 2 years before he adopted me. He was the quietest man I had ever encountered, and every sound in his house was a record of his presence, and standing in his office with the morning light cutting through the blinds, I could hear the refrigerator humming and the wall clock ticking and the foundation settling and nothing else, because nothing else was left. The folder was in the second drawer, labeled Estate in Harold's precise block print. Inside his last will and testament prepared by an attorney named Charles Whitaker, dated 3 years prior. I opened it on the desk and read the first page. Everything to Priya Desmond, sole beneficiary. The estate was valued at $2,700,000. I read the number. I read it again. I read it a third time. Harold drove a 2009 Civic. He wore 3 ties. He lived in a ranch house in Decatur and used coupons at the grocery store and mended his own clothes. $2,700,000. 32 years of an engineering salary deposited into index funds and left alone to do what money does when nobody touches it. Compound interest and a paid-off house and a life lived so far below his means that the distance between what he earned and what he spent accumulated into a number I could not reconcile with the man who had eaten burned eggs without complaint for nearly 3 decades. $2,700,000 was the mathematical equivalent of Harold's love. He had converted patience and discipline and Saturday mornings into a number he would never spend because the number was never for him. It was for the girl he picked out of the foster care system when she was 6 years old and too angry to eat breakfast. At the bottom of the folder, a second envelope. Sealed. His handwriting on the front, steady and clear. For Priya, when I'm gone. I put the envelope in my bag. I was not ready. 6 days later, sitting in Harold's office, surrounded by his filing cabinets and his engineering manuals, and the photograph of Ellen on the shelf, I opened it. Harold's letter began, "Priya, I need to tell you how I found you." The paper was thick, the good stationery he kept in the top drawer for letters that mattered. His handwriting was steady on the first page, and shakier on the second, and I would learn later from Whitaker that Harold had written this letter 8 months before his death, when the cardiologist first warned him about his heart and his spine. Harold had responded by going home and writing to me instead of scheduling the surgery they recommended. Harold wrote that in March of 2002, he was volunteering on a foster care review board in Fulton County. A caseworker mentioned a 5-year-old girl who'd been found alone in Lenox Square Mall. She had been standing next to the fountain for 3 hours before a security guard noticed that the small girl with the swollen eyes had not moved, had not called out, had not asked a single person for help. She had a quarter in her right hand. She would not let go of it. The girl's parents, Harold wrote, were named Vikram and Sunita Kapoor. They had told her to wait by the fountain while they went to look at something. They walked out of the mall, got into their car, and drove to their apartment in Marietta. They did not report her missing. They did not return. A police report was filed by mall security. 3 weeks later, the Kapoors appeared at Fulton County Court and signed a voluntary surrender of parental rights. Dated May 14, 2002. Harold had obtained a copy from the court records. He kept it in the filing cabinet. "They didn't lose you," Priya Harold wrote. "They left you. I need you to know that because someday someone might try to tell you differently." Harold asked to meet me through the foster agency. The caseworker warned him. The girl was difficult. She cried through the night. She refused meals. She screamed when men raised their voices or moved toward her too quickly. Harold told the caseworker he was familiar with all of those things, and could he please just come by on Thursday. He came to the foster home at 2 in the afternoon. I was sitting on the floor in the common room, not playing, not reading, not interacting with the other children, just sitting with my back against the wall and my hands in my lap. Harold sat down on the floor next to me. He did not speak. He did not try to touch me or talk me into a conversation. He just sat there, a large, quiet man on a linoleum floor for 20 minutes. Then he asked if I was hungry. I said no. He said he was going to make eggs in the kitchen if the staff would let him. I said I didn't like eggs. He said that was fine, I could watch. I watched. I ate half an egg. It was burned. "Perfect," Harold said. That was the beginning. The Monday after I finished Harold's letter, Charles Whitaker called at 8 in the morning. His voice was steady in the way attorneys' voices get when they're delivering information they expect to cause damage. The will had been filed for solemn form probate. Georgia law required that all potential heirs receive notice. The Kapoors had been notified through a skip trace. Whitaker's office ran as standard procedure. Vikram and Sunita Kapoor had filed a caveat contesting the will. Their claim undue influence. They alleged Harold manipulated a vulnerable child into a relationship designed to exclude her biological parents, and that the will should be invalidated or the estate shared among all surviving family members, including themselves. They're claiming standing as biological parents, Whitaker said. Their attorney is Glenn Hartley General Practice out of Marietta. They surrendered their parental rights in 2002. I know, their filing doesn't mention the surrender. I set the phone on the bathroom counter. My hands were trembling, a fine vibration in my fingers that I could see when I held them flat in front of me, a tremor I hadn't experienced since the first time I sat on the bench, and the bailiff said, "All rise," and I stood up in a robe. That was too big for me, and pretended I belonged there. I picked up the quarter necklace from the counter where I'd left it after my shower. The metal was cold against my palm. I closed my fist around it and squeezed until I could feel Washington's profile pressing into the center of my hand. 29 years. Vikram and Sunita Kapoor had been absent for 29 years. I had grown up in Harold's house. I had graduated from Emory Law at 25. I had clerked for a federal district judge at 26. I had served as an assistant DA for 3 years. I had been appointed to the bench at 31 after a confirmation process that included a background check, thorough enough to document every address I'd lived at since birth. I had spent my entire adult life in courtrooms, protecting children from the exact thing that had been done to me, and in all of those years not a single person named Kapoor had searched for me, called me, written to me, or appeared in any public record connected to my name, until Harold's will was filed. Until the number 2,700,000 appeared on a court document attached to the name of the girl they'd left at a fountain. The next morning, I walked into Ruth Odom's chambers and closed the door. Ruth Odom was the senior judge on the 4th floor, 52 years old, with a voice that could quiet a courtroom from 30 feet away, and eyes that missed exactly nothing. She'd clawed her way onto the bench from the Fulton County Public Defender's Office, tried over 200 felony cases before her appointment, and raised 2 sons alone after her husband left when the youngest was 4. She was the closest thing I had to a mother, though I would never have said those words out loud, and she would have cursed at me in 2 languages if I had. I told her everything: the mall, the quarter, Harold, the letter, the contest. Ruth listened without interrupting, without shifting in her chair, without any of the micro-expressions that people use to signal that they're processing. When I finished, she was silent for 10 seconds. Then she said 3 things. First, you need a probate litigator. Whitaker does estate planning. He drafts wills and sets up trusts. He is not built for a fight. Second, you cannot sit on your family court docket while this case is active. She held up her hand before I could object. If it becomes public that you're being sued by biological parents who abandoned you and you are simultaneously ruling on custody cases involving parental abandonment, every defense attorney in this county files a motion. Every termination ruling you've issued gets a second look. The appearance of bias is enough. Third, Ruth leaned forward. Read the rest of Harold's letter. I read it. All of it I had stopped at the second page. I'd read the names and the surrender date and Harold's account of how he found me, and I had folded the letter and put it away because I was shaking too hard to hold the paper steady. There was a third page. Ruth picked up her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and called a probate attorney named Marcus Lindell. She told him to expect my call by end of day. How long have you been on this bench? Ruth asked. 3 years. 3 years deciding custody for abandoned children, and you never once mentioned you were one. It's not relevant to my cases. Baby Ruth said, and she only used that word when no one else was in the room. It's the only thing that is relevant. Ruth stood and walked to the window of her chambers, which looked out over Pryor Street, and the traffic that moved below it in predictable patterns. She had her arms crossed. I had seen her use this exact posture in sentencing hearings, and it meant she was choosing her next words with the precision of a surgeon selecting an instrument. I've been on this bench for 19 years, she said, without turning around. I have seen exactly 3 judges burn out and leave. All 3 were carrying something they refused to name. You carry yours around your neck on a chain and you don't even see it. I touched the quarter. She was right, and the fact that she was right made the air in the room feel thinner. Go home, Ruth said. Read the rest of that letter, and call Marcus Lindell. He'll take your case because I'm going to tell him to, and because he has 2 daughters of his own, and because the law in this state is very clear about what your biological parents are entitled to. She paused. Which is nothing. Marcus Lindell's office occupied a corner of the 14th floor in a midtown building with an elevator that took its time and a lobby that smelled like the leather chairs nobody ever sat in. Marcus himself was 45, slightly rumpled, with a pen-clicking habit and a framed photograph of his 2 daughters on a desk, covered with legal pads. I gave him everything. The will, the surrender, Harold's letter, the probate filing, the caveat. He read for 30 minutes in silence. I sat across from him and listened to the pen click 3 times per minute while the afternoon light moved across his desk and the coffee in his cup went cold. This is the weakest will contest I have seen in 15 years of practice. He laid it out. First, the voluntary surrender of parental rights, executed in 2002, was irrevocable under OCGA. Section 1989. The 10-day rescission window had closed 24 years ago. The Kapoors had no legal status as parents. They could not claim standing to contest a will as biological family when they had voluntarily and permanently relinquished that designation. Second, even if some miracle of legal acrobatics gave them standing, the undue influence claim collapsed on examination. Harold was mentally competent until his death, as documented by 30 years of continuous employment with DeKalb County. The will was drafted by an independent attorney with no connection to Priya. There were no suspicious amendments, no deathbed changes, no evidence of any kind that Harold was anything other than a clear-headed man who chose to leave his estate to his daughter. Third, Harold had also established a revocable living trust in 2018. Upon his death, the trust became irrevocable. The $2,700,000 sat inside that trust outside the probated estate. Will contests do not apply to trust assets. The Kapoors could win the will challenge and receive absolutely nothing because there was nothing in the will to contest. Harold had already moved the money. They hired a general practice attorney who handles DUI and real estate closings, Marcus said. I don't think he's aware of the trust, and I am fairly certain they did not tell him about the surrender document. Why would they? Because they want him to believe they have a case. And without the surrender on paper, they might look like grieving parents shut out of their daughter's life by a manipulative adopter. Hartley might actually believe his own clients. Over the next 2 weeks, I went through every drawer and cabinet in Harold's house. I found the original police report from Lenox Square Mall dated March 3, 2002, printed on dot matrix paper with faded ink that smelled like a library basement. I found the foster care intake form with a social worker's handwritten notes describing a nonverbal, distressed female child approximately age 5 found unaccompanied. And I found 3 photographs taken at the DeKalb County Police Station on the night I was found. In the photographs, a small girl sat on a plastic chair, with her feet dangling above the floor. She was wearing a pink shirt with a stain on the collar and pants that were too short, and she was holding a quarter in her right hand with a grip so tight her knuckles were white. She was looking directly at the camera. She was not crying. Her eyes were swollen and dry, emptied out the eyes of a child who had run through every tear available to her and arrived at a place beyond tears where the only thing left was waiting. I held the photographs in Harold's kitchen, standing in the spot where he used to stand when he cooked. The metallic scrape of the filing cabinet drawer was still ringing in my ears, and the paper smelled like 24 years of storage, and the girl in the photograph was me, and she was not me, and the distance between her and me was Harold Desmond. 29 years of Harold Desmond every egg and every Saturday and every perfect. That evening I opened Harold's letter to the 3rd page. Ruth had told me to read it. All of it. I met your parents once, Harold wrote. In 2004, 2 years after the adoption was finalized. They came to the adoption agency and asked to speak with a counselor. Not to ask about you, not to inquire about your health or your school or whether you were happy. They asked whether surrendering their parental rights had forfeited any financial benefits, tax credits, or government assistance they might have been entitled to if they had kept you. Harold's handwriting was very steady on this page, steadier than the others, as though he had needed to be careful with each word. The caseworker told them no. There were no financial benefits attached to a surrendered child. They left. I was in the next room. The door was open. I heard every word. I set the letter down on the table. In 2004, I was 7 years old. I was in 2nd grade. I was learning to ride a bicycle in Harold's driveway. I had a best friend named Tanya, whose mother made lemonade that was too sweet. I was alive and growing and turning into a person, and Vikram and Sunita Kapoor were in an office 15 miles away, asking whether the daughter they'd abandoned was worth any money to them. The caseworker said no. They left. They walked out of the agency the same way they had walked out of the mall. Without looking back, without asking a single question about me. Harold continued, I spent my whole life making sure you'd never need anything from anyone. I know what they are, Priya. And I know what you are. You are the bravest 5-year-old I ever met and the bravest woman I ever knew. $2,700,000. 29 years of Harold eating burned eggs and driving a 2009 Civic and wearing 3 ties and putting every surplus dollar into index funds, where it sat and compounded and grew in the dark like a garden he tended without ever showing anyone the harvest. He never told me about the money. He never told me about the Kapoor's visit. He kept both secrets for the same reason. Because telling me would have hurt me, and Harold's entire existence was organized around the principle of not letting anything hurt me ever again. My parents were worth $2,700,000 to me. I was worth nothing to them. I was worth nothing to them unless I was worth $2,700,000. The counterattack arrived in week 4. Vikram Kapoor had Googled my name. He found my courthouse number listed on the Fulton County Superior Court website. He left a voicemail at 7:15 on a Monday morning, his voice rehearsed and careful. Priya, this is your father. We just want what's fair. Harold would have wanted us to be a family again. Please call me back. We're your parents. He had also contacted a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The pitch, a wealthy heiress refuses to share her deceased adoptive father's fortune with the biological parents who lovingly placed her for adoption because they couldn't afford to raise her. The reporter called Whitaker's office for comment. Whitaker called Marcus. Marcus called me. And Glenn Hartley had amended the Kapoor's filing. New claim fraud. The Kapoors alleged that Harold obtained the adoption through misrepresentation, that he concealed relevant information from the agency about the circumstances of the surrender, and that the adoption itself might be voidable, which would restore their parental rights and give them standing to contest. "It's desperation," Marcus said on the phone. The adoption was handled through Fulton County Family Court. The records are sealed, but they exist. Hartley is filing motions he can't support to delay the hearing and pressure you into settling. They want a check, Priya. This was always and only about getting a check. They're saying Harold stole me. The words came out of my mouth with a steadiness that surprised me, because underneath them my chest was compressing in a way that made it difficult to take a full breath. Harold, who had never once raised his voice at me. Harold, who had driven to my college orientation and carried my boxes up 4 flights of stairs, and sat in his car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before driving home because he was crying, and he did not cry in front of me. Harold, who spent 32 years designing drainage systems so that water would go where it was supposed to go, and who spent 29 years doing the same thing with love. They were calling him a thief. They are saying whatever their attorney told them might buy time. This is about leverage. They want you to calculate the cost of fighting versus the cost of writing a check, and they're betting you'll choose the check. I did not choose the check, but the ground was shifting beneath me. This was no longer about a probate hearing. They were attacking Harold. They were constructing a narrative in which the quiet man who ate burned eggs and drove a Civic and chose me every day was somehow the villain, the manipulator, the man who stole a child from loving parents. And the reporter at the AJC might write that story because the story of a greedy heiress makes better copy than the story of 2 people who walked out of a mall and left their daughter next to a fountain. Ruth came to my office the next afternoon. She closed the door. She did not sit down. I heard about the newspaper inquiry. Marcus is handling it. Marcus is handling the legal case. I am handling you. She put both hands flat on my desk and leaned forward. You need to step back from your docket. Today, I've already recused myself from any cases that might involve the Kapoors or their attorney. That is not enough, and you are too smart to pretend it is. Ruth straightened. You sit on this bench every day and rule on parents who abandon their children. You are currently a respondent in a contested probate case filed by parents who abandoned you. If Hartley connects those dots, and he will, because the AJC inquiry will eventually lead someone to your courtroom bio, he files a motion arguing that every one of your 12 termination rulings this year was driven by personal bias against abandoning parents. Every one of those families gets a new hearing. Every one of those children goes back into the system while the appeals are processed. The room was very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system cycling and a door closing somewhere on the floor below us, and the distant sound of a phone ringing in an empty office. Those are my cases, Ruth. Those are my kids. They are the court's children, and you are Harold Desmond's child. Ruth looked at me with the expression she used when she was about to say something she would rather not say. You need to act like it. After she left, I sat in the courtroom alone. The overhead lights were off. The bench was just wood and a microphone and a nameplate that read, Han, Priya Desmond. I ran my thumb across the raised letters the way I ran my thumb across the quarter, feeling the shape of something that had defined me. 3 years on this bench. The youngest judge in the county. 47 custody cases. 12 terminations. 3 emergency removals. I had built this career as a fortress against the girl at the fountain. Every ruling I issued was a small correction of what had happened to me. A recalibration of a universe that had failed a 5-year-old and then kept spinning. And Ruth had just told me to step away from it. I did not go to Harold's house that week, or the one after it. I worked on the case with Marcus from my apartment, reviewing documents, drafting responses to the amended fraud claim. I slept badly. I ate at irregular hours. I did not cook eggs. The pan in my own kitchen hung on a hook by the stove, and I looked at it every morning and walked past it. On a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after Ruth's visit, I drove to Decatur. Harold's garden had gone wild. The tomato cages were leaning sideways in the November wind, and the herbs along the fence had grown into each other until you couldn't tell the basil from the oregano. The front walk needed sweeping. A flyer for a lawn service was wedged in the door, handle the paper swollen from rain. I let myself in with the key that had always worked, The house smelled different the way houses smell when no one has opened the windows or turned on the stove in weeks. It was cold inside. November in Decatur, and Harold was not here to adjust the thermostat, and the house was cooling degree by degree into something that resembled storage rather than home. I stood in the kitchen. The pan was on the third hook. The table had its nick. The window showed the garden. I did not take the pan down. I did not turn the burner on. I pulled out a chair and sat at the table and put my hands flat on the oak surface and closed my eyes. My breathing slowed until I could hear my own pulse. The tick of the wall clock, the settling of the foundation, the refrigerator humming in its steady monotone. My fingers pressed into the grain of the wood, and the kitchen was cold around me, and the light through the window was thin and gray, and Harold was not here and would never be here again, and I was sitting at his table the way I had sat on the floor of the foster home, not moving, not asking for anything, just waiting. Behind my closed eyes, I was at the fountain, 5 years old. The quarter was in my hand, heavy and wet from the fountain water, and the mall was loud with voices and music and shoe sounds on tile. Somewhere above me, a child laughed, a bright sound that bounced off the atrium ceiling. Somewhere behind me, a security guard's radio crackled with static. I was watching the glass doors at the entrance. My mother's blue jacket. My father's thick glasses. Any second they would come back through those doors and explain and take me home, and everything would make sense. I waited 1 hour. I sat on the edge of the fountain and swung my legs and counted the coins at the bottom. I waited 2 hours. I stopped swinging my legs. I waited 3 hours. A security guard named Mitchell crouched down next to me and asked my name, and I told him, and he asked where my parents were, and I said they were coming right back. And he looked at his partner, and his partner picked up a radio. In Harold's kitchen 29 years later, I was still waiting. I was a judge and a lawyer and a homeowner and an heiress, and some part of me had never left that fountain. Some part of me was still watching the doors. The refrigerator clicked on. The ice maker rattled a brief mechanical clatter that Harold used to call the house clearing its throat. The sound pushed through the memory. I opened my eyes. The kitchen was the same. The clock ticked. The garden grew wild through the window. I took Harold's letter from my coat pocket. The paper was wearing soft at the folds. I turned to the last paragraph, the lines I had read and reread but had not yet absorbed, because absorbing them would require accepting something I was not equipped to accept. You don't have to win, Priya. You just have to know that I chose you. Every single day I chose you. I folded the letter and put it back in my pocket. I pressed my palms against the table and pushed myself up. The chair scraped the floor, a sound that had once meant Harold was standing to clear the dishes, and my body carried the motion the way it carried everything. Harold had taught it how to stand, how to eat, how to hold a fork, how to walk into a courtroom and own the silence. I looked at the pan on its hook, and the table with its nick, and the garden through the window, and something loosened in my chest. Not suddenly, but slowly, like a knot that has been worked at for years and finally gives. Harold did not leave me money. He left me proof. I drove to Marcus Lindell's office. I want to change the approach, I said from the doorway. Marcus looked up from a stack of deposition transcripts. His pen was in his hand. How? No counter-filing for sanctions. No motion seeking attorney's fees. Present the evidence. The surrender document. The trust. Harold's letter. Let the law do what it was built to do. We had a strong case for sanctions. Frivolous filing. Concealment of the surrender document. We could have made it painful for them. Harold didn't raise me to be cruel. Marcus clicked his pen twice. He raised you to be a judge. Then I'll let the evidence speak. The probate hearing was scheduled for a Thursday, 6 weeks and 2 days after Harold's death. Fulton County Probate Court Courtroom B, on the 2nd floor. The courtroom was smaller than mine, wood-paneled walls, and a flag in the corner and fluorescent lights that buzzed at a slightly higher frequency than the ones in my own building, and the benches in the gallery were the hard wooden, kind that make people shift in their seats. I arrived at 8:30. Dark suit. No robe. The quarter necklace hung below the collar of my blouse, visible if you were looking for it. Marcus was already at the respondent's table with his briefcase open and 3 folders arranged in the precise order he would present them. At 8:40, the Kapoors walked in. Vikram was wearing a suit that did not fit him, the jacket wide across the shoulders and the pants breaking too far over his shoes. His glasses were thick, the kind with progressive lenses that make your eyes look like they belong to a slightly different person depending on the angle. His hair had thinned to a gray shadow. He moved stiffly, favoring his left side, and he held Sunita's elbow as they walked down the aisle as though they were entering a church rather than a courtroom. Sunita was smaller than I had pictured. She wore a dark salwar kameez with a dupatta wrapped around her shoulders, and her fingers worked the fabric the way my fingers worked the quarter chain. I watched her hands. They were my hands. The same small bones, the same nervous, restless motion, the same instinct to hold on to something when the ground was unsteady. She did not look at me. Glenn Hartley sat between them with a manila folder and a legal pad. A man who had taken this case because a couple from his neighborhood asked him to help their daughter's family get what was fair, and who was about to discover that his clients had not told him the truth about anything. Judge Coleman called the case. In the matter of the estate of Harold Raymond, Desmond deceased. Marcus stood. He presented the will first. Proper execution. Independent attorney. No amendments within 5 years of death. Harold's employment records demonstrating continuous mental competency through age 69. Hartley objected. The petitioners were never notified of the will's existence. The petitioners had no legal relationship to the testator, Marcus said without inflection. Marcus presented the second document. He placed it face up on the table where Hartley could see it. The voluntary surrender of parental rights dated May 14, 2002. Signed by Vikram Kapoor in blue ink. Signed by Sunita Kapoor in blue ink. Witnessed by a court clerk named Angela Hodges. Filed with Fulton County. Irrevocable after 10 days under O.C.G.A. Section 1989. 24 years, irrevocable. Hartley's expression shifted. It was the expression of a man who has just stepped off what he assumed was solid ground and found air beneath him. He turned to Vikram. Vikram's jaw tightened, and his hands gripped the edge of the table, and he did not look at his attorney. Marcus presented the trust document. A revocable living trust established by Harold Desmond in 2018, naming Priya Desmond as sole beneficiary and successor trustee. Upon Harold's death, the trust became irrevocable. $2,700,000 in assets held within the trust corpus outside the probated estate, not subject to will. Contest, not subject to caveat, not reachable by any claim the petitioners had filed or could file. Hartley stared at the trust document. He had not been told about this. He had taken on a case built on things his clients chose not to mention, and the case was disintegrating in front of him, document by document, like paper held over a flame. He asked for a recess. Judge Coleman denied the request. Marcus entered the final piece of evidence. Harold's letter, all 3 pages submitted as Respondent's Exhibit D. The letter detailed Harold's discovery of Priya through the foster care system, the circumstances of the adoption, and the 2004 visit. The visit where Vikram and Sunita Kapoor walked into an adoption agency and asked whether their surrendered daughter was worth any money. Vikram stood up. His chair scraped the floor. His voice was tight and loud and carried to every corner of the small courtroom. That is not what happened. We were worried about her. We wanted to see her. We wanted to know if she was safe. Marcus said nothing. He let the letter sit on the evidence table. Sunita, who had not spoken a single word during the proceeding, who had sat with her hands in her lap and her dupatta twisted around her fingers, looked down at the table. She twisted the fabric once, twice. Then she said in a voice so quiet that the court reporter leaned forward and asked her to repeat it. I almost went back. The courtroom held the sentence the way a room holds sound after a bell rings. Almost. She almost went back to the mall. She took 3 steps toward the entrance. Vikram grabbed her arm. She did not go back, and in 29 years she had polished those 3 steps into something that resembled courage, had told herself the story of almost returning so many times that it had calcified into a substitute for the thing she did not do. Almost. The word that measures the distance between what you could have been and what you chose to be. Judge Coleman asked if there were further witnesses or evidence to present. Hartley looked at his blank legal pad. He did not respond. The courtroom door opened. A man in a gray suit entered the gallery from the hallway, a lawyer from one of the courtrooms on the fourth floor, someone I had seen in the elevator and the parking garage and the courthouse cafeteria for 3 years. He was looking for a seat. He saw me at the respondent's table. He nodded the way colleagues nod when they pass in a corridor, and said in a voice meant to be polite, but carrying clearly across the small room, "Good morning, Judge Desmond." Hartley's head turned. Vikram's head turned. Sunita looked up from her hands. "Judge." The word crossed the courtroom like a crack, spreading through glass. Hartley looked at me. He looked at Judge Coleman on the bench. He looked back at me. I could see the calculation assembling behind his eyes, the sudden understanding that the woman at the respondent's table was not an anonymous adoptee, not a nobody, not a girl who had stayed broken in the shape they had broken her. I was a sitting judge in the building next door. I was a colleague of the man who had just greeted me. I was someone the entire Fulton County legal establishment called by a title, and Hartley's clients had walked into this courtroom, assuming they would find a grateful orphan who would write a check to make them go away. Vikram stared at me across the aisle. His face had gone slack. His hands were still gripping the table, but the grip had changed, loosened, as though the thing he was holding onto had stopped supporting his weight. I met his eyes. I did not speak. There was nothing I needed to say that the documents had not already said. "We didn't know you became." This, one syllable. He did not say successful or powerful or a judge. He said this, a word that contained the full scope of what he had thrown away and could not now retrieve. A word that meant we left a 5-year-old at a fountain, and she became something we cannot comprehend, and we came here expecting to find the broken thing we discarded, and instead we found this. Judge Coleman ruled. The caveat was denied. The petitioners lacked standing under O.C.G.A. Section 5.3.2.1. and by virtue of the executed and irrevocable voluntary surrender of parental rights. The trust assets were not subject to will contest. Attorneys' fees and costs were assessed to the petitioners. Case dismissed. I held the quarter in my right hand through the entire ruling. I did not squeeze it. I did not rub it. I just held it the way you hold something that has been part of your hand for so long that letting go would feel like losing a finger. In the hallway, Marcus shook my hand. Cleanest probate defense I've ever filed. Ruth was standing by the elevator. She had been in the gallery the entire time. I had not seen her walk in. She did not say anything. She crossed the hallway and put her arms around me, and I stood very still inside the embrace because Ruth Odom had never hugged me in 3 years of mentorship, and the weight of her arms against my back was the first thing that had carried Harold's warmth since Harold died. In the parking garage, I sat in my car with the engine off. The keys were in my lap. My hands were on my thighs, palms down, and they were shaking again, the same fine tremor from the morning Whitaker called, except this time the tremor was not fear. It was the aftershock of something that had been held rigid for 6 weeks and was now very slowly releasing. I put my forehead against the steering wheel and breathed. The concrete structure amplified every sound, tires on the ramp above a car alarm cycling in the distance, and under all of it the quiet of my own breathing. I picked up the quarter chain from my chest and held it against my mouth. I was not praying. I was holding something real. 1 week later, Saturday morning, my apartment indicator. I took the pan down from its hook. I turned the burner to medium. I cracked 2 eggs into the pan and watched them cook, adjusting the heat when the edges started to brown, tilting the pan the way Harold taught me when I was 9, and finally strong enough to hold the handle steady. I slid the eggs onto a plate. They were not burned. I sat at my table. The apartment was quiet. The morning light was thin and clean late November light that turned everything it touched into something worth looking at. Outside the window, a cardinal landed on the balcony railing and stayed for 3 seconds, its head twitching side to side, before it lifted off and was gone. I had filed to return to my docket. Ruth approved the request the same afternoon. The Kapoors had not appealed. Hartley's office sent a letter acknowledging the ruling and requesting a payment plan for the assessed attorney's fees. Marcus forwarded it to me without comment. I hung the quarter necklace on a hook by the front door. I did not need to wear it anymore. It was not gone from my life. It was where I could see it every time I came home, a small, tarnished coin catching the light from the hallway, and that was enough. The gavel was back on my bench. Harold's letter was in a frame on the bookshelf. The pan was on its hook. Everything was where it belonged. The eggs were perfect. 4 months later, I sat on my bench and listened to a grandmother petition for temporary custody of her 3-year-old grandson. The boy's parents were both incarcerated. The grandmother was 61, worked part-time stocking shelves at a Kroger in Conyers, and had driven 45 minutes through morning traffic to stand in my courtroom without an attorney holding a folder of documents. She had organized with color-coded tabs. Her hands shook when she held the papers. She apologized 3 times before she finished her first sentence. She called me, Your Honor, the way people do when they've practiced it in the car on the way over. I walked her through the process. I asked the questions the court needed answered, and I gave her time to find the words. When she stumbled over the legal terminology, I translated it. When she cried, I waited. When she apologized for crying, I told her there was nothing to apologize for in this courtroom. The attorneys in the gallery exchanged glances. Judge Desmond was different than she had been 6 months ago. Not softer exactly. Something more precise than soft. Clearer, as though a pane of glass that had always been between her and the people in her courtroom had been cleaned, and the view on both sides was sharper now. I granted the petition, temporary custody to the grandmother with a 6-month review. The grandmother pressed both hands together and looked at the ceiling, and then she looked at me, and in her eyes was something I had seen in Harold's eyes once 28 years ago in a foster home common room, the expression of a person who has just been told they can take a child home. Thank you, Your Honor, she said. You don't need to thank me. You need to go pick up your grandson. She left the courtroom holding the folder against her chest, the way some people hold infants, as though the papers inside were the child himself, and I sat on my bench for a full minute after the courtroom emptied, listening to the important. Fluorescent lights hum their steady frequency, and the sound was the same as it had always been, and I was the same, and I was different. After court, I drove to Lenox Square Mall. I had not been there since I was 5. The mall had been renovated multiple times, expanded and refitted with skylights and marble, and stores that hadn't existed when my parents left me next to the fountain. But the fountain was still there, different tile around the basin, different coins at the bottom, shinier than the one I'd taken. The same sound. Water falling on water. A constant cycle of collapse and renewal. I sat on the nearest bench. I took a quarter from my coat pocket, a new one purchased from no particular memory. I held it in my right hand and listened to the water. Families passed, and couples with shopping bags, and a group of teenagers filming something on a phone. Nobody looked at the woman sitting alone on the bench holding a coin because there was nothing remarkable about her. A woman sitting. A Tuesday afternoon. A security guard walked by. Young, maybe 25, with a radio on his shoulder that crackled with the same static that radios have always produced in this building. He paused. You doing okay, ma'am? I looked up. The radio crackled. The fountain splashed. Just remembering something. He nodded the way people nod when they are satisfied everything is fine and walked on. In my bag, underneath the court files and the lunch I hadn't eaten, there was a letter. Not Harold's. A different letter received 3 weeks ago, postmarked Athens, Georgia. From Mira Kapoor, age 23. My half-sister, a person whose existence I had not known about until Marcus's research turned up 2 additional children born to Vikram and Sunita after they surrendered me, Raj, 26, and Mira. The letter was short. Mira's handwriting was round and careful, each word chosen. I didn't know about you until the lawsuit. My parents never told us. I'm sorry for what they did. I don't expect anything from you. But if you ever want to talk, I'm here, Mira. I had not responded. I had placed the letter on my kitchen counter, propped against the salt shaker, and every morning when I cooked eggs, I looked at it, and every morning I did not open it again, and every morning I did not throw it away. A sister. The word was unfamiliar in my mouth, a room in a house I did not know existed, and I was standing in the doorway, and the light inside was warm, and the decision had not arrived. I put the new quarter back in my pocket. I stood up from the bench by the fountain. The water kept falling coins, glinting at the bottom like small, bright promises nobody would keep. I walked out of the mall through the same glass doors Vikram and Sunita had walked through 29 years ago. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, and the November air hit my face, cool and sharp, carrying the smell of exhaust and fallen leaves from the parking lot landscaping. I was walking on my own terms, and there was nobody waiting for me in the parking lot, and that was fine. That was how it was supposed to be. The thing about a courtroom is that everyone in it believes their own story is the true one. I have spent 3 years on the bench listening to people testify under oath about events they have rearranged in their own memories until the rearrangement is all that remains. Mothers who are certain they are good mothers, fathers who are certain they did their best, children who are certain it was their fault. Vikram's story was sacrifice. He told himself he gave me up so I could have a better life, and over 29 years the telling smoothed the rough edges until the story gleamed. When he saw the number 2,700,000 on a court document, the story shifted easily to accommodate it. His sacrifice had paid off, the girl had prospered, and now the original investors deserved a return. Sunita's story was almost 3 steps toward the mall entrance, 3 steps she has replayed and polished until they resemble bravery, when they are only the shadow of bravery shaped like it and empty inside. I almost went back. She said it in a courtroom the way a person confesses to a priest, expecting absolution, expecting the word almost to carry the same weight as the act itself. It does not. Almost is the cruelest word in any language. It is the word for the distance between what you could have done and what you chose. Harold's story was different from all the stories I hear in my courtroom. Harold's story was not about almost or sacrifice or what he deserved. Harold's story was eggs on Saturday mornings and a Civic in the driveway and 3 ties and an index fund and a letter written on good stationery with a hand that was already shaking. His story was choice. He chose to volunteer at the review board. He chose to ask about the girl nobody wanted. He chose to sit on a linoleum floor next to a 5-year-old who would not eat and wait 20 minutes in silence. He chose her every day for 29 years in every burned egg and every school pickup and every Saturday morning until choosing her was not a decision anymore, but the architecture of his life. There are people who love you for what you can give them, and people who love you for who you are at 5 years old with a runny nose and a quarter in your fist. If you are lucky, if you are very lucky, you find one of the second kind. I found Harold. Part of me was waiting for Sunita to fight. To stand up in that courtroom and say she spent 29 years regretting it, that she tried to find me, that Vikram held her back. She did not say those things. She said almost, and that was the truest thing she has ever said, and it was not enough. It will never be enough. I do not know if I will write back to Mira. Her letter is on my kitchen counter between the salt and the pepper, and some mornings I pick it up and read it and set it down. A sister. A word I have never used for another person. A door I did not know was there, and the light on the other side is warm, and I am standing in the frame. The quarter is on the hook by the door. Harold's letter is on the bookshelf. The pan is on the 3rd hook. The eggs are cooling on the plate. Mira's letter is propped against the salt. I pick up my fork. The apartment is quiet. The morning light falls across the table, across the letter, across my hands that are the same shape as Sunita's hands, holding a fork the way Harold taught me, and the eggs are perfect, and this apartment is mine and outside the window. The city is waking up and I eat.